Picture a Tuesday. You wake up, scroll your phone, eat something fast, sit for hours, scroll again, eat again, sit again, and somewhere in there wonder why you feel vaguely hollow. You tell yourself you are just tired. But the real answer is far stranger than tiredness. The real answer is that your body is living inside a schedule it was never designed for, running a life that would be completely unrecognizable to the version of you that existed just a few thousand years ago. So, what did ancient humans actually do all day? The answer surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Because the assumption most people carry, the image burned into the collective imagination, is one of constant, desperate struggle. Hunting mammoths, running from predators, scraping for survival from the moment the sun rose until the moment it set. A brutal, exhausting race against death. That image is wrong, and the evidence for just how wrong it is has been building quietly in anthropology labs for decades. The anthropologist Marshall Salins was one of the first to name it clearly. In his landmark 1966 essay, he described hunter-gatherer societies as the original affluent societies. Not affluent in the modern sense, not wealthy in the way you would recognize. Affluent in time, affluent in rest, affluent in something that most people reading this right now have almost none of: unstructured hours with nowhere to be. Think about what that actually means. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups like the Shaskung-san of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, have been used by researchers for decades as a window into how pre-agricultural humans likely organized their days. The anthropologist Richard Lee spent years living alongside the Akung in the 1960s and came back with numbers that stunned the academic world. The average adult, he found, worked somewhere between 2.5 and 4 hours per day to meet their basic needs. Not 8 hours, not 10, 2.5 to 4. The rest of the day was not spent anxiously planning for tomorrow or strategizing about quarterly goals. It was spent doing what humans, left to their natural rhythms, apparently want to do more than almost anything else. Talking, resting, playing, telling stories, sitting by a fire and watching the dark. Your ancestors were not running at full speed all day. They were, by modern standards, astonishingly leisurely. But this is not the whole picture, because when ancient humans were working, they were not doing anything like what you would call work today. The anthropologist David Graeber, before his death in 2020, spent years examining the nature of human labor across cultures and time periods. What he found was a consistent pattern. Pre-agricultural work was almost always varied, embodied, social, and meaningful, in an immediate and visible way. You went out and found food. You brought it back. The results were concrete and tasted good. The loop was short and satisfying. What did a foraging day actually look like? The morning would often begin slowly. No alarm. Light woke you. The camp would stir gradually, not all at once, because sleep was not a single 8-hour block but something looser and more interrupted, more attuned to the rhythms of darkness and dawn. The historian Roderick Hirsch spent 20 years researching historical sleep patterns and found strong evidence that biphasic sleep, sleeping in 2 separate chunks, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between, was the human norm for most of history. The modern insistence on a single consolidated block of sleep is itself a recent and somewhat strange invention. So you wake slowly, you eat whatever remains from the night before, and then the day begins to organize itself around a set of activities that are so different from your Tuesday that they barely belong in the same category. Gathering, for most groups, was where the bulk of calories came from, not hunting. Hunting gets all the drama, all the cave paintings and the mythology, but studies of modern forager groups consistently show that plant foods, nuts, roots, berries, and tubers supply between 50 and 80% of the diet in most environments. Women in many groups were the primary gatherers, and a successful gathering trip, enough to feed the group for a day, might take 3 hours. 3 hours of walking through familiar landscape, talking, noticing things, picking things up, knowing which plant meant what, reading the ground the way a person today might read a street. Your ancestors knew their environment with an intimacy that is almost impossible to imagine now. The anthropologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, writing about indigenous ecological knowledge, describes this relationship with the land not as expertise, but as kinship. The plants had names, the plants had histories. The relationship between a foraging person and their landscape was not one of extraction, but of long acquaintance. After gathering came the middle of the day, and here is where the picture becomes almost uncomfortable to look at if you are reading this on a Tuesday. The middle of the day, in most groups studied, was rest, not the guilty 20-minute desk nap you might steal. Real rest, extended rest, the kind where you lie down and you are not thinking about email. The Hadza, observed by evolutionary biologist David Pilbeam and later by anthropologist Frank Marlowe, would often stop activity entirely during the hottest part of the afternoon. They would sleep, talk softly, do nothing in particular. The concept of wasted time did not exist, because time was not yet a resource to be optimized. Time was simply the medium in which life was lived. This matters more than it sounds. The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, whose decades of research on happiness and flow are among the most cited in the field, found something counterintuitive when he studied what people actually reported feeling during different activities. Leisure, passive leisure especially, did not reliably produce happiness. People often felt better, more engaged, and more alive during skilled activity than during unstructured downtime. But the key word is skilled, not scheduled, not monitored, not evaluated. Skilled activity chosen by the person doing it in service of something real and immediately meaningful. Foraging was this, making tools was this, storytelling was this. The evenings were when something else happened entirely. Fire changes everything. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham, in his landmark 2009 book on the evolution of cooking, argues that fire was not just a culinary technology, it was a social technology. Fire extended the day. It created a space, the hours after dark when the world became too dangerous or too dark to work in, that had no precedent in animal experience. It created the campfire, and the campfire created something that may be the single most distinctly human activity of all: storytelling. But before the stories began, there was preparation. Roots pulled from the ground, tubers scraped clean, vegetables sliced and sorted and set near the heat. The act of preparing food together was as social as eating it. Every hand had a task, every task had a rhythm. Preparing ingredients was not a chore you did alone in a kitchen. It was something the group did together, talking the whole time. And speaking of preparing food, try the 16-in-1 multifunctional vegetable chopper. Your ancestors spent real time and real effort breaking down roots, tubers, and greens by hand every single day. You have a shortcut they never did. This manual food slicer lets you dice, slice, julienne, and chop vegetables in seconds, with 16 different blade attachments, a built-in draining basket to rinse as you go, and a handguard so you keep all your fingers. It is the kind of tool that makes cooking feel less like a burden and more like the quick, satisfying act it was always supposed to be. The cognitive scientist Brett Seligman and the anthropologist Polly Wiesner have both studied campfire conversation among contemporary forager groups. Wiesner's research with the Kung found the daytime talk was mostly practical: food, resources, complaints about people. Evening campfire talk was almost entirely stories, myths, jokes, memories. Talk about people who were not there. The campfire was, in a very real sense, the original entertainment platform. It was where the community's shared imagination was built and maintained, where children learned who their people were, where old knowledge was passed down in the most memorable form available to a culture without writing. Your ancestors stayed up late. They did not have a consistent bedtime. They fell asleep when the fire died down, often in stages, waking briefly in the cool, dark hours, and then sleeping again until light. So what does an ancient human day actually look like? Broken down, late waking, slow start, a few hours of gathering or hunting or tool making, a long, unhurried midday rest, more productive social activity in the late afternoon, cooking, eating together, and then hours by the fire telling stories until the dark took over. Variable, social, physical, meaningful in the immediate and visible sense. Now picture your Tuesday again. The biologist Robert Sapolsky, whose work on stress is some of the most comprehensive in existence, describes a fundamental mismatch between the stress response your body evolved and the stressors of modern life. Ancient stress was acute and physical: a predator, a fall, a fight. It lasted minutes, and then it was over. Modern stress is chronic and abstract: an inbox that is never empty, a schedule that never resolves, a sense of falling behind on something that has no finish line. Your stress hormones do not know the difference. They were designed for the former and are being triggered by the latter every day, indefinitely. Your brain is not broken. Your brain is running ancient software on a system it was not designed for. And maybe that is why the Hollow Tuesday feeling exists, not because you are not doing enough, not because you are failing at optimization, but because somewhere inside the architecture of your body is a version of you who spent the afternoon lying in the shade, who knew every plant within a 3-mile radius, who went to sleep when the fire died and woke up in the dark and was not afraid of the silence. That version of you did not do very much, and that version of you was, by almost every biological measure, remarkably well. Tonight, when you sit down and feel that vague restlessness, that sense that the day should have amounted to more, remember that your ancestors would not recognize what you just did as a day at all. They would find your Tuesday, the sitting, the scrolling, The artificial light keeping you awake long past dark, far more exhausting than anything they ever faced on the savannah.